So I think that you have already answered to this first question. What is your opinion about the monetary union in Europe and about the euro system? So
yeah.
we said already.
The euro system was always a disaster waiting to happen, and Wynne Donnelly put it beautifully back in 1992. He said that the people who designed this system must, if all they design is a currency, but they have no supranational treasury to go with the supranational central bank, then they must believe capitalism is inherently stable. Because it is not, a crisis will come along at some point, probably caused by private debt, and when that crisis occurs, the states of Europe, where the state should be creating money to compensate for the decline in credit-based money, will instead be forced to cut their own spending as well. And he then made a remarkable statement when he written in 1992, which is, what is that, 15 years before the crisis itself occurred, and almost 10 years before the euro came into existence. He said, when the crisis occurs, the only escape from it will be emigration as the only alternative to poverty or starvation. Now, he wrote that in 1992, and I'm sure he was regarded as complete extremist and mad interpretation, nowhere near as sane and responsible as the people who put the euro. He was right. And this is where the massive waves of migration that are allowed by the Euro Treaty from the impoverished regions that are being suppressed by the Euro to the areas which have benefited out of the Euro, or to the regions that don't have the Euro, which is, of course, the UK. That's where that migration wave has come from, which is adding to social tensions. It's actually, the whole idea of the Euro was to try to bring together Europe. I think, in fact, it's the major force driving Europe apart. So unless we abolish the Euro and go back to national currencies, or we establish a supranational treasury which compensates for the financial flows, it means it doesn't matter, then we're going to have more and more social breakdown in Europe. Now, since I think there's zero chance of the treasury being formed, that's why I'm in favour of breaking up the euro.
As Vladimiro Jacquet in his book Anschluss points out how the German monetary unification has destroyed by 44% the GDP and by 67% the industrial production of the East Germany. Do you think that the fact that Italy has lost 25% of its industrial production could not have been predicted by the builders of the monetary union? Is it a project or just a mistake?
I think it's a mistake, and I think if you look at when German unification occurred, you had East German factories which were producing Traberts and West German factories producing Mercedes-Benzes. And one of the jokes in the socialist system was that they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. Okay, so what actually happened in the factories was low productivity, low quality, crappy products like the Trabert being manufactured, and workers getting wages they couldn't spend because you had to be in a queue to buy any products. So you'd accumulate these large bank balances, which were meaningless because there were no products to spend them on. An ex-girlfriend of mine, Romanian, said that when she wanted to buy a television set, she was in a 10-year queue to get the television set. And she managed to go to America and buy one and bring it back. And so she had a TV before anybody else did. But all these people built up huge bank balances in Eastern Europe, which were worthless in terms of buying products in Eastern Europe before unification. When unification occurred, what should have happened is the East German mark should have been worth, say, this is only arbitrary to say 10% of the West German mark. And then what that would have meant was the East German factories would have been competitive, even though producing crappy products. It would have been really cheap to buy a Trabert in Western, and you want a young kid wanting a car, you could get a Trabert, and then there would have been a potential to increase the industrial base of East Germany over time. Instead, because they made one mark worth one East German, worth one West German, it meant suddenly all these East Germans had all this money, they could suddenly buy Mercedes-Benzes with and so on, and of course that was the end of anybody buying Traberts, so they lost their jobs, and they bought a consumer product, and then they were bankrupt. So what they could only do is be supported by the West German state. Now, give the West Germans their credit. That's what they did. There's such a strong national sense about the reunification. People in West Germany tolerated the financial transfer that taxation implied to enable those East Germans not to starve after their factories collapsed. And that gradually has transformed East German slowly, and a lot of these Germans moved to West Germany, of course. So this is all, in a sense, it's a microcosm of what happened with the euro, with the exception that the West Germans were willing to cover the taxation benefits for the transfer.
Of course.
Now, of course, you have the situation of the euro, exactly the same damage by forming one currency, but no taxation compensation, and they're wondering why these southern European countries, like especially Italy, are angry about the euro.
In your book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis?, you talk about the origin of the basic mistake of considering macroeconomics as derived directly from standard microeconomic theory. Do you think that the European Union treaties having imposed the balanced budget to the states are born from this point of view?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if you look at the real basis of that view is the ordo-liberal school of thought, which comes out of Germany, and it's like a combination of the Austrian attitude about the private sector and being anti-government, but combined with the Germanic attitude that you need rules, which the government then enforces. So the government's there to try to enforce microeconomic thinking. And part of that attitude is the state shouldn't run a deficit, because running a deficit, it runs out of money, you know, and we can't spend any more, and our kids get debt in the future, which is nonsense, because the government is not a money warehouse, it's a money creator. So that's a mistake in micro thinking. So yeah, the same thing, the same problem of extrapolating from a household to the entire nation, which doesn't make sense because a household cannot print its own money. Yeah, I mean, if you want to extrapolate from the micro to the macro and make it sensible, then you give every house a printing press. Because we can obviously see the problems with that. That's why you have the state creating money, which we all are part of, and the banks should be doing it responsibly, which of course they aren't. But so the whole extrapolation from the micro to the macro is an incredible mistake in intellectual reasoning. And I give an example in the book that what economists have done is, the trouble is that the public doing this or the politicians doing it I can understand, because they're not experts. It's when the economists do it themselves, that's the real travesty, because they should be experts and they're not. They are effectively the same as looking up in the sky and saying, "Oh, the sun, you see it's orbiting us, so the Earth must be the centre of the universe." But the experts are telling it. You can't blame the non-experts for believing garbage. But because the experts believe this myth that you can extrapolate from the micro to the macro and then all these mistakes come out of it, the public ends up making those mistakes themselves, and so do the politicians.
So I think that the last question of this group, do we have to wait for a global crisis to change our point of view, or is it possible to work on it in order to avoid the global collapse?
Unfortunately, I think we need a crisis. And the reason for this is it's the way humanity tends to behave. You know what it's like yourself. You're campaigning for a change, but the system appears not to be broken to anybody. So the old cliche, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah. And like people, you're passionate about monetary reform, but most people are as passionate about monetary reform as they are passionate about knowing how their car engine works. Now, they're never passionate about knowing how the car engine works unless they're a mechanic and they enjoy that sort of stuff, or be the car's broken down. Only after it breaks down do they get fascinated about how does it work, because it's currently not working. And the same thing applies to seems to be a common rule in society and humanity in general. If you go back to issues like the collapse of the Roman Empire, there were people who were warning the trends that were going to lead to the collapse. Imagine Easter Island, if you know Easter Island, which is the island where we have these strange monoliths that I think they're called moas, that is these giant faces facing out towards the sea. They were part of a religious cult on Easter Island, but to actually move the moas from where they were quarried to where they were placed, you had to cut down trees and use trees to roll the moas. And over time they cut down every last tree on Easter Island. Now surely somebody was saying, if we keep on going this way, we're going to run out of trees. And run out of trees, that's going to be the end of a major part of our hunting and gathering system. But they still cut down the last tree. And so the crisis was coming. It was visually obvious that this had to stop. But the cult that said we had to build these Mauis kept on going until all the trees were gone. And then, of course, the cult could no longer work, because you could no longer move the Mauis from where they were quarried to where you wanted to place them. And the social system broke down. And this, unfortunately, I think that's a microcosm of what we're doing on the international scale. We've got to the stage where we're having a monetary crisis caused by not realising what's wrong with our money system, and an ecological crisis by not realising what we're doing to the planet by the amount of additional energy we're pumping and waste we're pumping into the biosphere. And plenty of people are warning about these two crises, and nothing is being done until after the crisis occurs. And even then, if you know the monetary system, we're still paralysed and still doing nothing sensible. And the ecological crisis, I think, when that hits us, a similar sort of thing is going to happen there. Then ultimately we might try to reverse it, but I just hope we can regrow those trees.